Hi, my name is Shefali Mehta, and today I'll be talking about project-based learning in the secondary classroom. I've been a high school teacher for about 15 years, and I'm currently at Princeton High School in New Jersey, which is in the United States. I will start by talking about what project-based learning is, and then we'll talk about how to change your course structure to maximize the benefits of project-based learning. And then lastly, I will go through some examples from my classroom. When we talk about project-based learning, it's more than just adding a project. The project has to be really well developed and has to actively engage your students in something that is meaningful and applies hopefully to the real world. When you're designing your project, you can look at having them create solutions to problems, debating something. They can get on both sides of the debate, or maybe they'll all be on the same side of the debate and discuss all the pros or cons of something. You can also have them raise awareness of a community-based problem that maybe not a lot of people really know a whole lot about. When you have a well-designed project, they will help to motivate students as they're learning content. It is also good to have an open-ended project so students have some choice in what they're doing and how they express their learning. It helps to build really strong connections between what they're learning in your class versus what's going on outside. And the most important thing, I think, is students will become more critical about what they're thinking because they're going to be applying it right away. And they'll even want to go deeper into the content because they know that they can apply it to something meaningful to them. In my experience, when I first started teaching, I usually gave content, some kind of assessment, and then the project. And when I did that, I found a couple of problems. One, I didn't feel like I had enough time for feedback. We're doing all the project in one little short period of time. And as a result, I couldn't give the feedback and then turn it around before the next day when they were going to continue working on the project. The second thing was by the time we got to the project, a lot of students had lost the content. They didn't retain it very well. And so I spent a lot of time reteaching or explaining things again, reviewing the content, and it wasted a lot of time. And in the end, the projects were not as high quality as I would have liked. Some of them were because some students definitely would get into it, but not all projects were of high quality. So what I've done now in conjunction with some of the teachers that I work with, we have tried to make everything have context. So we've started to introduce the project at the beginning of the unit. Here we then talk a little bit about what students might need to know in order to complete the project. And that usually delves into all the other course content that we're going to do anyway. So after giving the introduction, we start going through the content, constantly referring back to the project and how it relates to the project, giving them time in the middle of the content to go back to their project and work on their project, piece by piece. And then we give their assessment. And then by the end of the project or by the end of the unit, their project is mostly done. We've also had more time to give them feedback as they went through the unit. And their projects are much better than what they would have been otherwise. We also don't need to spend time reviewing any of the content because again, the project is done now. And because the quality of the projects were better, I even felt more comfortable having other people coming into my classroom from the school or from the community to observe what the students were doing. I would like to now go through some examples from my classroom. The first one is a top 5 telescopes project. And here the goals as far as content was concerned was learning how telescopes and light work, to observe the universe, and then also to look at all the ground and space-based telescopes that have been built across the world and in conjunction with different space agencies. And their project was to create a top 5 list of telescopes. As they're doing this, we start with a discussion. They select a ground-based and a space-based telescope to focus on, and they start to think about what do we need to know? And they start to bring up, well, we need to know how a telescope works. We need to know how light works. We need to know how they all kind of work together. Why do we even need telescopes? And so all of those things are topics that I plan on introducing in the course of this unit anyway. So now that they've said, well, we need to know about that, now I can provide the content for them. And they feel like they had a choice in what we were doing. And they feel as though they need to know this information in order to make their top 5 list. We spend time going through the content. As we're going, they're going to be researching. They'll spend a couple days here and there creating an infographic or some other kind of presentation. We also talk about how telescopes have changed over time and the advancements and how the technology has changed in regards to analysis. And then at the end of all of that, we spend time sharing all of the research with amongst the class, and then having students discuss and ask questions and get more information if maybe something was missing. After that, we get into small groups and students will create a top 5 list. The reason I like groups is because then there has to be a discussion. There has to be a back and forth. Students have to kind of debate what is really important about these telescopes. And as they discuss and debate, they make their top 5 lists, and then they share their top 5 lists with the rest of the class, including what their reasoning was for making their top 5. At the end of that, they then do a reflection, which I think is a really important piece of the project. They need to think about all the other lists that were created and shared, and they need to think about where their list kind of falls amongst all of them. Do they like it the way it is, or would they like to change it and modify it? This is a project, an infographic that one student made for the Uhuru telescope. The next project that I'd like to talk about is the manned versus unmanned missions debate. And here, the goal is really to learn about the different kinds of missions that have gone out into space, things from probes to flybys and orbiters and landers and all of that, as well as manned missions, which include the International Space Station, Apollo missions. Those are the ones that are more common in the United States. So those are the ones I'm familiar with. But we also want to think about the benefits and drawbacks of those missions. Their project is to really debate whether or not they feel that the unmanned missions are more important in the next 5 to 10 years, or if the manned missions are manned and unmanned missions are most important for the next 5 to 10 years. I try not to go too far ahead because I think then it becomes one-sided, but by sticking with the 5 to 10 year mark, there's really more of a 50-50 idea as far as what they're going to debate. We again start with a discussion. This is a small unit, so there's not a lot of content here other than really doing the missions. So they each select a mission. We then talk about the different kinds of missions and how they compare with each other in that respect. We also talk a little bit about how missions have changed over time and how technology has changed. Usually I have them create an infographic. They share their research. They share about all of these missions. And then we do the debate. The debate is pretty much a 30-second speech that shares their position and reasons for why they have that position. Then they all share their speeches. Then they have time to talk with each other and ask each other questions and refute different arguments. And then at the end, again, we have a reflection. Do you still feel the same way? And if they feel the same way, that's great. If not, maybe they've heard something that changes their mind. That's great too. Either way, I want them to reflect on what they've heard. One year, I chose not to do the debate due to time constraints. And so I did a letter to the head of NASA. And so these are some of the quotes from their letters that they wrote. The last project I want to talk about is a solar system classification project. And here their goals were to learn about the scale and scope of the solar system and all the different objects within the solar system. Their project was to create a new classification system to classify all of the objects that we're going to be learning about. So we start with how do we classify things? And we talk about the tree of life. We can talk about matter. How do we classify matter? Multiple ways of classifying things. And then we get into students making their own models of the solar system, which is usually missing some pieces of information, but it's a good start. And they also make lists of the kinds of objects there are. And then we talk about what properties do we need to know about these objects in order to really classify them. So we start making those lists. We start defining some of those properties if they're not familiar with them. And then I have a list of about 45 to 50 objects within the solar system that I split up within all the students. And depending on how many students there are, I'll have anywhere from 3 to 5 objects per student. They research all of the properties that we decided were important. And then they share all of that information with each other. And again, we decide if there's enough information. If we need more information, then we may go back and do some more research. And then once all the data is compiled, we then sit down and get into groups and students start creating their classification systems. And it's really interesting to hear the kinds of conversations they have because they're going to talk about what is important and how do we separate all of these objects into different things, and is the system that we have right now good, or what can we do to improve it? They then share all of their classification systems as a class, and then again we do a reflection where students have time to think about whether or not they like something that maybe another group mentioned and whether or not they would include that in their own classification system, or if they think their classification system was good enough. These are some samples from what students have created. You can see on the left, there's the hot moons category, and where they start to talk about tidal forces and how that creates friction and heating inside the moon. On the right, you can see how the students separated habitable versus non-habitable objects. And here's another one where they separated the objects into rocky, gas, and icy rocky objects, and then they split them up further after that. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this talk.